The scripture this morning comes from the book of Mark, chapter 6, 45 through 52. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against the adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. May we have eyes to see and ears to hear what God is telling us.
Thank you, Kay. I want to start with a story. It may be true, I'm not sure. It's about a farmer, and a young boy. A young boy lived on a farm. He had a dog, a beautiful Labrador. And every day during the spring and summer, the young boy would take his Labrador down to the pond on the farm, and every day they would practice retrieving for hours on end. As the fall and winter months slowly came in, so too did duck season. And sure enough, on the first day of duck season, the young boy and his dog were the first to find their spot down in the blind down by the pond. After a short time, they heard the ducks flying over, and the boy raised up, shot 3 times, and a duck fell into the center of the pond. Giving the dog the permission it sought, the lab left, charged through the blind and the brush to the pond, where instead of swimming through the water as in practice sessions past, walked on the surface of the water, picked up the duck, and then trotted back to the boy, walking right on top of the water. Well, as you can imagine, the boy was astounded, amazed by it, and he thought, no one is ever going to believe this, that this dog can walk right on top of the water. I've got to get somebody else to see it. And so he went down to the farmer who lived the next farm down and said, "I've got to show you something. Would you come and go duck hunting with me tomorrow morning?" And so the farmer agreed, and so they set off just like the day before. The young boy, the lab, and now the neighboring farmer took their spot next to the pond and patiently waited in the duck blind. And just as the day started, they heard the ducks coming in, and the boy let the farmer get up and shoot, and he shot 3 times, and same thing that happened the day before. Duck fell into the middle of the pond, and the boy gave the lab the permission to go out into the middle of the pond and get the duck, and the lab charged through the blind and the brush. Again, walked on top of the water and retrieved the duck and walked back with the duck in its mouth right on top of the water. Amazed and proud and barely able to contain himself, the boy looked at the man, and the man looked at the boy, and the boy asked, "So what do you think?" And the farmer responded, "Well, I didn't want to say anything to you, but your dog doesn't know how to swim." I don't often start with jokes because it feels too much like Joel Osteen doing his thing. But I couldn't let that one go by. I just thought that was hilarious. Now, I want to say, before I start, that I have been thinking about this for a while, and I believe that the church could use a good heresy trial. Now, what I'm saying is, people think church is just, kind of the same way as it's always been, and it's boring and the whole thing. And so I have a friend who was in Watertown, South Dakota, and he was brought up on heresy charges. This was about 20 years ago. Do you think that kind of excited the people in the church? Oh my. It was all over South Dakota. There's a heresy trial going on at the First United Methodist Church of Watertown. And I thought to myself, what if I had something like that happen here? I am going to preach a sermon, and for some of you, it will sound like heresy, right? It will sound like it. And so if you want to bring charges, I'm ready. Now, I went back in my files. I was looking at this story, and I thought, have I ever preached on Jesus walking on the water before? I had. In 2008, August of 2008, I had preached a sermon called Walking on the Water, and so I got it out and I read it, and it was terrible. It had to be one of the worst sermons I'd ever preached, and I thought to myself, oh, how I hope those people forgave me. And they must have, because I got to stay in Arvada for another 8 years. But I can tell you, it was a terrible, terrible sermon. And so I'm not going to share anything about that sermon with you this morning, except this one thing. I want to share this one thing that I thought was so interesting. And it's this. And this book it's called The People's New Testament Commentary. It's by M. Eugene Boring. What a terrible name for a professor. That's unfortunate. But it's by Eugene Boring and Fred Craddock. Now, Fred Craddock is probably one of the most famous preachers of the last century. He's just terrific. And anyway, they put this commentary together, and this is what I wanted to share to you, because I want to talk to you a little bit about miracles today. And this is what they said about miracles. According to the New Testament, miracles are performed by these following groups of people, or God. Number one, miracles are performed by God directly. 2, by God through an angel. 3, by Jesus. 4, by apostles, including Judas. 5, by good disciples, missionaries, ordinary Christians. 6, by bad, false, unbelieving disciples. 7, false Christs and false prophets. 8, by non-disciples, Jews and pagans. So as you go through the New Testament and you think about, there's 64 miracles in the New Testament, by some people's count. And the conclusion that they say is, in the Hellenistic world, in the Greek-speaking world, miracles belong to the realm of the possible and constitute an accepted part of the worldview of most people. Their meaning is what is disputed. Their meaning is what is disputed. Now, I wanted to share that with you because I wanted to talk about this miracle story. When you're a child, as you go through the developmental stages, you might hear a story like this and you will literally believe that it is true. You'll literally believe that Jesus could walk on the water. That's part of our faith development stage. And in fact, I would say to you that at this point, in the 125 of us who are here, there are people who understand, believe 100% that Jesus could walk on the water. That Jesus could walk on the water. Those folks are on one side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum are people like Thomas Jefferson, who, during the 1770s, 1780s, took a New Testament and with a pair of scissors cut out every story that had anything to do about miracles. People who believe that it's 100% true and can happen. Thomas Jefferson over here, who cut out the miracles and made his own Bible called the Jeffersonian Bible. You can buy them still on Amazon if you want to. Here's what I contend. That you don't have to be over here to 100% believe it. And you don't have to be with Thomas Jefferson throwing away all the miracles in the Bible. Because I think the miracles tell a story. And so, if you're like me, you find yourself somewhere inside of those two edges. Because if you throw away the miracles, sometimes you just throw away the faith. You just throw it away. And so, I contend to you that there is a space for some of the rest of us. Now, if you are on one or the other side of those spectrums, you believe it 100%, I'm going to ask you simply to listen, because I'm going to talk to those people who have 21st century minds and are figuring, I can't understand Jesus walking on the water, okay? You just get to listen in today. I'm glad that you're here. I love your type of faith. I can't do it myself. And so I'm going to preach to the people who are, maybe not with Thomas Jefferson, they haven't taken their Bibles and cut them up, but who have definite troubles with those miracles. Sound okay? All right. Come to a story like this. And I gave it to Sharon, the 9 o'clock liturgist. I said, would you read this? She said, I'll be your liturgist at 9 o'clock. She came to me after she read it, and she said, there's a couple things that strike me as odd in this story. And I said, oh? Because here's the first thing that I would say. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. Some Greek scholars think that walking on should have been interpreted walking by. Now that's something interesting, isn't it? I'm not a Greek scholar, so I can't weigh in on that, but I thought that was an interesting thing. But I'm going to bracket that, and I'm just going to set that aside for a minute, okay? You can think about that if you want to. He came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. This is the sentence that confused and stopped and made Sharon think, and maybe it makes you think. He intended to pass them by. He intended to pass them by. He wasn't going to help. Is that not a strange sentence in the middle of that story? He intended to pass them by? What's going on? That's what biblical scholars do. They look at a story like that, and they look at for a sentence or a clue, and they say, something is going on. I want to know what's going on. If you have a Bible in front of you, go ahead and grab it. Go ahead and grab it. I want you to turn to Exodus, if you would. It's pretty near the front. Genesis, Exodus. Go to chapter 33. It's about on page 67 in your Bibles, I think, if we all have the same one. Page 67, chapter 33. Got it? Okay, at the very bottom, I'm going to read a piece, and I'm going to suggest to you that this line, he intended to pass by them, is an echo from this story about Moses speaking to God. I'm going to submit to you that this line is an echo for us. Let's start with number 15. Moses said to him, in this case, him is going to be God, Moses said to God, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you're pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" The Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you and I know you by name." Then Moses said, "Now show me your glory." And God said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But," God said, "you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Then the Lord said, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock when my glory passes by." When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. I'm going to suggest to you, could it be possible that as Mark was thinking about who Jesus was, and he wants his hearers to know who Jesus was, the Son of God, the Messiah, that he is using an echo from Exodus and that point in time when God passes by. He intended to pass them by. Could it be? Well, biblical scholars, some, would say that is absolutely what Mark meant by that sentence. Mark meant to lift Jesus up to the same level as God. Now, here's the second part. At the very end, you might have noticed it when Kay was reading it. "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. Of course they were, for they did not understand about the loaves. I told the students, the Wesley Bell ringers, if they had written a story for their English class assignment where they had told a story and then came up with something not about the story in the story, if the English teacher would circle it and say, "What is that?" For my mind, now this is just my mind, you get to choose. Which one is the bigger miracle? Which one is the bigger, oh my goodness. Go to a picnic, after the picnic's gone, you gather up the rest of the food, the potato salad, the potato chips, the celery and the carrots that are left, and you have a basket full of food, or somebody walks on the water. Which one is the bigger miracle to you? I'm going to contend that it's walking on the water. That would shake you more than getting baskets of food left over a picnic, 5,000 people. I'm just going to say it. You might disagree with me. You might say, it's the loaves. Mark, the author, is saying, they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves. That's just the craziest thing, isn't it? That's the heresy part, if you want to, They were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves. I'm going to suggest, because the loaves story was right before this. We didn't read it, but it was right before this in chapter 6 of Mark's Gospel. And it is about the feeding of the 5,000. And nowhere in that story does it say the disciples didn't understand. They only didn't understand where they were going to get all the food. And so somehow this story, this sentence in Mark, takes us back to the loaves miracle and the walking on the water miracle. And then it says what I think is the most difficult thing about this story. After they've seen two miracles, Mark says, but their hearts were hardened. Don't you have a question about that? If you had seen the loaves multiply, if you had seen somebody walking on the water, do you think your hearts would be hardened? No. Your hearts would be softened and thinking, this man that we know is something special. This guy is something. This is making my heart not only soft, but spilling over with amazement and awe. Wouldn't that be the way that you would think would happen after you saw somebody walking on the water or expanding those loaves? Wouldn't you? I would. My heart would not be hardened. But that's what it says. My heart, their hearts were hardened. What does Mark mean? Mark has to mean something. What could Mark be meaning? Here's what I suggest. This is what I think Thomas Jefferson was crazy. He should have left those miracles in there, because you get to ask the question. When you ask these questions, it helps you to dive deeper into these stories and into the faith that we walk with day by day. That's what I think. Don't throw away the stories, Tom, I would tell him. There's no reason to do that. This is what I'm going to suggest. In the Gospel of Mark, there's a thread through it. It's called the Messianic Secret by some. In the 1920s and 1930s, that was one of the major, well, it wasn't the major way that scholars were looking at the Gospel of Mark, but it was part of the way that some scholars were thinking about Mark. Because in Mark, there are all these different stories about the parables and the disciples not understanding the parables. And then Jesus telling the disciples, don't tell anybody who I am. The stories about the disciples with their hearts hardened. Stories at the end of Mark where the disciples flee from Jesus after the crucifixion. There are all these stories, and the Messianic Secret was exactly that. Why? Why was it so difficult for the disciples to understand who Jesus was? But there were two characters in the Gospel of Mark who understood who Jesus was. First, the woman, if you remember, she has a container of oil, and she breaks it and pours it over Jesus' head. And Jesus says, as long as the good news is preached everywhere, what this woman has done will be remembered. And the second person, so she knew who he was. The second person who knew who he was the centurion at the crucifixion. Jesus dies. The centurion proclaims, this truly was the Son of God. Do you remember? Two people, not in the inner circle, who knew who Jesus was. So what I contend that Mark was doing for people who were reading that and hearing Mark's gospel 30 to 40 years after Jesus had died and was resurrected, was to say, you don't have to be a disciple. You don't have to be one of the inner circle to understand who Jesus was. That's what I think a story like this that says the disciples' hearts were hardened is suggesting to us. That we with our own faith journeys, our own faith stances, get to decide who he was. Now, for those people who believe that Jesus walked on the water, that's not a hard thing. But for those people who are having a hard time with walking on the water, like I do, that's another way of seeing what that story is about. It lets us dive into these stories in a new way. Yeah? Have you heard that before? If you haven't heard it before, I think that's a shame, because those seminary professors were teaching that the last 80 years. And they didn't think that you could handle it. And that makes me mad. I think you can handle it. Because you get to have a choice between throwing away all the miracles and thinking that Jesus was walking on water. You get to have your own faith. You don't have to hitchhike on mine. But you get to think about these things for yourselves. And you may come up with completely different answers than what I did right there, with those difficult things in the Gospel of Mark, in that story. You get to think about it. And that makes faith richer. Amen? Amen.